Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we dive deep into the forgotten and haunting stories of America's past. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our channel. Today, we take you to Tennessee in the early 1800s, to a story that has haunted local memory for generations. A tale of courage, revenge, and the shocking power of one woman who refused to remain invisible. This is the story of Judith of Tennessee, the enslaved woman's shocking Thanksgiving. Revenge. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, sometime in the early 1800s, life for the enslaved was a daily grind of labor, fear, and silent endurance. Among the many souls bound to the land was Judith, a woman whose strength and resolve were forged in the fires of oppression. Her days began long before sunrise, the chill of dawn biting through the thin layers she wore, and her body moved through the rituals of servitude with a precision born of necessity. She cooked, cleaned, tended the gardens, and answered every whim of the family that held her in bondage. Yet, beneath her quiet obedience burned a mind sharp, aware, and haunted by the injustices she could never escape. Judith had been in the Grayson household for nearly a decade. She had seen the rise of one master's temper, the subtle cruelties that left scars invisible to the eye but permanent to the soul. She had watched as her fellow enslaved companions were beaten, sold away, or broken by despair. The Graysons were not known for kindness. Thanksgiving, a time the family celebrated with pomp and pride, was a day of extra labor for Judith and the other enslaved people. They prepared feasts, polished silver, and scrubbed floors, all while hiding the exhaustion behind forced smiles. The master of the house, Jonathan Grayson, was a man whose authority went unchecked, whose ego was as vast as his lands. He was a man who measured loyalty, not by affection, but by submission. His sons, eager to inherit their father's wealth and status, observed the household with the same cold detachment, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the suffering that sustained their comforts. To them, Judith and the others were nothing more than tools, silent instruments in a grand performance of family pride and social standing. Yet, Judith's mind was far from silent. In the quiet moments, when the family slept or dined, she thought. She remembered the faces of those who had been torn from her world. She remembered the laughter of children who had known no kindness. And she remembered, most of all, the countless small indignities, the humiliation that had been forced upon her body and spirit over the years. Every command she obeyed, every forced smile, every hidden tear was etched into her memory. And like water-carving stone, a plan began to form, not born of mere spite, but of a deep, inevitable justice that had been delayed for far too long. The preparation for Thanksgiving that year was grueling. Judith rose before the first light and worked until the evening candles flickered low. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same tasks countless times. Yet every step of the meal she prepared was measured, deliberate, a quiet stage on which a drama was unfolding only in her mind. She chopped, stirred, seasoned, and arranged, each motion precise, each decision carefully considered. To the family, she was the perfect servant, the invisible hand behind their feast. But beneath that polished exterior, Judith's mind was a whirlwind of strategy, each detail of the day calculated for the moment when the world, as they knew it would shift irrevocably. The Graysons, oblivious, bickered over trivialities as Judith worked. Jonathan Grayson complained about the placement of the centerpiece. His sons argued over the quality of the turkey, and the house resounded with a sense of entitlement that was almost suffocating. Judith listened, smiling softly, her face calm and obedient, hiding the storm that raged within her. She had learned over the years that appearances could deceive, that power was fragile when wielded carelessly, and that patience could be as lethal as any weapon. As evening fell and the family. Gathered around the table, the house seemed to pulse with expectation. Jonathan Grayson raised a glass in a toast, his sons echoing his words with practiced smiles. The meal was laid out with lavish care, every dish a testament to Judith's skill. The aroma of roasted meats, spiced vegetables, and sweet pies filled the air, a carefully constructed lure that masked the undercurrent of tension and anticipation that only Judith sensed. She moved among them, serving plates, pouring drinks, her eyes flicking briefly to each member of the family. They saw only the dutiful servant, the invisible woman who ensured their comfort. They could not see the mind working silently, calculating the precise moment when centuries of injustice would demand its reckoning. And then, as the family began to eat, something subtle yet profound shifted in the air. Judith had waited for this moment for years, an eternity measured not in hours, but in the relentless march of oppression. Every smile she offered, every dish she set before them, was a part of a narrative they would never understand until it was too late. The master, confident in his control, took the first bite, unaware that the hand that had fed him had long since been guided by resolve that could not be denied. The sons followed, oblivious, their laughter and chatter masking the undercurrent of horror that Judith had carefully orchestrated. The first tastes of the meal went unnoticed, the family too caught up in their own delight to sense the subtle shift. Judith stood nearby, her hands folded, her expression serene, the very picture of a loyal servant. And in that moment, history itself seemed to hold its breath, the calm before the storm, the quiet before the revelation that would forever stain the memory of this Thanksgiving. The house was alive with the sounds of family indulgence. Silverware clinked against porcelain, and the rich aroma of roasted meats mingled with the faint sweetness of pie. Laughter and chatter flowed freely, masking the undercurrent of tension that only Judith could sense. She moved with quiet grace, attending to every need, pouring wine into glasses and topping plates with care. Her hands were steady, her face calm, yet inside her mind a storm of years-long resentment and careful planning raged like wildfire. This Thanksgiving was different. Judith had watched and waited, noting the precise movements and habits of the family, memorizing routines, understanding weaknesses. She knew which son favored the turkey's dark meat, which one had a particular fondness for the sweet potato pie. She had studied their faces, their moods, their fleeting expressions of arrogance, and she had prepared. Every step of the meal had been orchestrated to achieve a singular purpose, one that would transform the ordinary festivities into a memory that would haunt the family forever. The sons, unaware of the danger beneath the surface of this ordinary domestic scene, argued over trivial matters, a seating arrangement, a missing fork, the proper way to carve the turkey. Jonathan Grayson, the patriarch, boasted loudly about the size of the harvest, the prosperity of their household, and the strength of their family name. Judith smiled softly, each word reinforcing the illusion of her obedience, each glance reminding the family that she existed only to serve, only to be invisible. They did not see the intelligence in her eyes, the careful plotting that had gone into each dish, each preparation, each seemingly innocent gesture. The first course was served, a medley of roasted vegetables, tender meats, and delicate breads. Judith moved among them, filling glasses, responding to requests, and observing reactions. She noted the subtle mannerisms, the way Jonathan paused briefly before tasting the turkey, the way one son would silently adjust his napkin, the other's impatient tapping of his fingers. These small details, insignificant to them, were the threads of a tapestry that Judith had been weaving for months, maybe years. Every detail mattered. Every choice mattered. As the main course arrived, the house seemed to settle into a rhythm. Conversation flowed freely, punctuated by laughter and the occasional sharp comment. A family, confident in their privilege and control, were blind to the quiet tension simmering beneath the surface. Judith, ever the consummate observer, moved among them with grace, keeping her expression neutral, hiding the storm that swirled within. She had waited for this precise moment, understanding that timing was everything. A moment too soon or too late would ruin the plan, and she could not afford failure. Each dish she presented carried the weight of history, the quiet suffering of years, the stolen joys, the hidden scars. She had labored endlessly, not merely to feed, but to craft an instrument of justice that would speak in a language the family could not ignore. Her heart pounded silently, not with fear, but with a grim resolve. This was the culmination of every humiliation, every punishment, every act of cruelty inflicted upon her. The careful patience of a decade was about to bear fruit, and the family, lost in their entitlement, remained blissfully unaware. Jonathan Grayson carved the turkey, his hands large and confident, while his sons leaned in, eager to partake in the feast. Judith watched closely, noting their movements, their glances, their expectations. She had planned for this precise sequence, and the anticipation was almost unbearable, yet necessary. Every action, every bite, every word spoken was part of the ritual she had designed. They would never see it coming, not because she had been clever in some ordinary sense, but because they had been blind for so long, blind to the humanity of those who served them, blind to the quiet intelligence and resolve of the people they considered invisible. As the family ate, Judith moved with subtlety. Each plate she carried, each dish she presented, was part of a carefully calculated narrative. She observed their reactions closely, noting which flavors they favored, which portions they left untouched. Her mind, though calm on the surface, raced with precision, measuring the impact of every morsel, anticipating the inevitable moment when the reality of her actions would dawn upon them. The air in the house, thick with food and conversation, held an unspoken tension, a silent countdown to the moment when control would shift irrevocably. The sons laughed at a story their father told, oblivious to the grim significance of the meal before them. Judith's face betrayed nothing, yet inside, a wave of grim satisfaction began to swell. This was more than revenge. It was a reclamation of agency, a final assertion of dignity in a life otherwise constrained by chains and cruelty. She had waited for the perfect moment, the moment when their arrogance and sense of entitlement would meet the consequences of years of unseen suffering. The hour of reckoning approached silently, invisibly, like a shadow creeping across the walls of the house. And then, as the family reached for the centerpiece, the final dish of the meal, the tension, so carefully concealed, began to ripple outward. Judith's presence was still that of the loyal servant, her hands steady, her smile soft, her movements practiced and elegant. Yet beneath that calm exterior lay the storm, the culmination of years of observation, calculation, and silent endurance. This was the threshold, the moment she had prepared for with meticulous care, the moment when history itself would remember the Thanksgiving of Tennessee not as a day of family celebration, but as a day of shocking, irrevocable justice. The final dish was set before the family, and Judith's heart beat with a steady rhythm that belied the storm within. To the Graysons, it was merely the last course of a Thanksgiving feast, a simple indulgence before the evening drew to a close. To Judith, it was the culmination of years of suffering, of every indignity she had endured silently, and the precise moment when her painstaking preparation would force the family to reckon with the consequences of their cruelty. Every movement she made, every careful placement of a dish, was deliberate, measured, and heavy with purpose. Jonathan Grayson, oblivious to the tension cloaked beneath the surface of his household, lifted his knife and fork and began to serve, himself from the centerpiece. His sons, eyes bright with anticipation and mouths already watering, leaned forward. Judith observed their actions quietly, ensuring that every detail aligned with her plan. She had prepared the meal not merely as a sustenance but as a mechanism, a controlled instrument that would deliver a message the family would never forget. Each bite they took, each morsel consumed, was a testament to her resilience, her intelligence, and her careful patience. The family ate, laughed, and boasted, unaware of the reality hidden in plain sight. Judith's calm exterior betrayed none of the tension, none of the grim satisfaction that coursed through her veins. She moved among them, topping drinks, adjusting napkins, and responding to requests with the practiced politeness of a servant who had long since mastered the art of invisibility. Yet beneath that surface, a reckoning was unfolding. Every moment of obedience she had displayed over the years, every silent nod, every hidden tear, had been a piece of a larger plan, one that was now reaching its inevitable conclusion. As the evening wore on, Judith's mind remained razor-sharp, calculating, observing. The Graysons, in their entitlement, were blind to the signals she had carefully planted, blind to the subtle details that hinted at the true nature of the feast. They had treated her as invisible, as nothing more than an instrument for their comfort, and in doing so, had left themselves vulnerable to the quiet, relentless intelligence that had gone unnoticed for years. Judith had waited for this very moment, knowing that timing and precision were everything. A single misstep could ruin the plan, and yet everything had been executed flawlessly. Slowly, subtly, the realization began to creep into the minds of the Graysons. At first, it was a fleeting thought, a faint unease as they noticed the unusual taste, the strange texture of the meal they had consumed without suspicion. Their laughter faltered, replaced by confusion. Jonathan Grayson paused mid-sentence, a fork hovering uncertainly over his plate. His sons exchanged glances, a question forming silently between them. The room, once filled with joy and self-satisfaction, grew heavy with tension. It was a silence that spoke louder than words, a moment of dread that settled like a weight upon the family. Judith stood, her expression serene, her hands folded before her. She had fulfilled her role as the servant to perfection, her obedience unassailable in the eyes of the family. Yet the truth of her actions was now undeniable, a shadow falling across the Graysons' pride and arrogance. The years of oppression, the hidden suffering, the relentless subjugation, they had all converged in this single chilling moment. The family, confronted with the consequences of their cruelty, could do nothing but stare in disbelief. Their laughter silenced, their authority shattered. In that room, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The Graysons, who had once believed themselves untouchable, who had treated Judith and others as less than human, were now faced with the horrifying reality of her agency, her intelligence, and the consequences of their neglect. The weight of years of injustice pressed down upon them, and for the first time they felt the fragility of their control. Every boast, every insult, every act of cruelty returned to them in a form they could neither deny nor escape. Judith's eyes met theirs, calm and steady, and in that silent gaze lay the story of decades of suffering. She had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed, but never powerless. The meal, the ritual, the careful orchestration of every detail had been her voice, her statement, her undeniable proof that she was more than the chains and orders imposed upon her. The family could no longer pretend that they were masters of the house, of their own destiny, or of her spirit. In a single deliberate act, she had reclaimed her dignity, her agency, and had left an indelible mark upon the history of that household. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. The Graysons' confusion and horror gave way to fear, a fear rooted not only in the act itself, but in the realization of how thoroughly they had misjudged the woman they had held in bondage. Every glance they exchanged carried the weight of disbelief. Every word spoken faltered, and the air in the house grew thick with unspoken tension. Judith, standing quietly among them, embodied both the calm of inevitability and the quiet triumph of justice. She had waited, observed, and acted with precision, and now the consequences of her carefully executed plan were unavoidable. The house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence after the meal. The Graysons, once confident in their dominion, sat frozen, unable to speak, their faces pale and their hands trembling. The weight of what had occurred pressed down upon them like a tangible force. Every boast, every cruel remark, every act of subjugation they had imposed over the years now seemed insignificant against the undeniable reality of Judith's act. They were confronted with the full measure of their arrogance, and it was a revelation they could neither soften nor deny that Judith moved among them with quiet purpose, her expression composed and serene. She spoke only when necessary, her words calm, measured, and imbued with a power that came from years of silent suffering. Every glance she cast carried authority, every movement demonstrated control. The Graysons, for the first time, truly saw her not as a servant, not as invisible, not as property, but as a human being of intelligence, will, and undeniable agency. The realization was almost too much for them to bear. Their privilege, their assumed superiority, their unchallenged authority, all of it had been shattered in the span of a single evening. Outside the house, the quiet Tennessee night seemed to echo the tension within. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the weight of history, of injustice long denied and finally confronted. Judith's act was more than revenge. It was a statement, a reckoning, and a reclamation of humanity in a world that had tried relentlessly to deny it. The Graysons' sense of security and dominance, built over decades of unquestioned power, crumbled like fragile porcelain, leaving only the stark, uncomfortable truth that they had been blind to the lives and minds of those they enslaved. Of the events in the Grayson household, spread slowly at first, whispered along the dirt roads and riverbanks, carried by those who had long known the injustices hidden behind the grandeur of the manor house. Some spoke in hushed tones, horrified and fascinated by the audacity of Judith's act. Others saw it as a grim, cautionary tale, a reminder of the limits of human cruelty and the inevitability of justice, even when delayed. Judith herself became a shadow in local memory, a figure whose actions were simultaneously feared, respected, and retold with a mix of awe and disbelief. The Grayson family, once secure in their social standing and perceived invulnerability, were forever marked by that Thanksgiving. Their wealth, land, and social connections could not erase the memory of the day when their sense of control was violently undermined. It became a story repeated quietly, a dark legend that lingered in the minds of the community. They were forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the lives they had dismissed as insignificant were filled with intelligence, strategy, and an unyielding desire for justice. For Judith, the act was not merely about retribution. It was a reclaiming of selfhood, a declaration that she was more than a body bound by chains or a life defined by the whims of others. In that calculated moment, she demonstrated the profound truth that resilience and intelligence could never be entirely suppressed, even in the face of relentless oppression. Her courage, patience, and precise execution transformed her from an unseen servant into a figure of undeniable agency, a woman whose story would echo far beyond the walls of the Grayson house and the confines of that single Thanksgiving night. History remembers Judith not as a villain nor merely as a survivor, but as a symbol of the enduring human spirit. She became an emblem of resistance against the unrelenting injustices of slavery, a reminder that dignity and justice can be reclaimed even under the harshest of circumstances. The Thanksgiving of Tennessee, once intended as a celebration of family and prosperity, became instead a story of reckoning, a stark testament to the consequences of cruelty and a reminder that those who are silenced and oppressed often possess a power that is quietly, inexorably formidable, even decades later. In the quiet corners of Tennessee and beyond, storytellers recounted the events with a mixture of horror and reverence. Judith's name, whispered with awe, carried the weight of a life lived under oppression, but marked by intelligence, courage, and unyielding resolve. The Graysons, once figures of unchecked authority, were remembered primarily for the day when their assumed control was shattered by the woman they had underestimated. And through it all, Judith's legacy endured, a chilling yet inspiring testament to the capacity for resilience, strategy, and the ultimate assertion of justice in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the end, the story of Judith of Tennessee remains a haunting reflection on the human condition, the depths of cruelty, the endurance of spirit, and the unassailable power of intelligence and resolve. It is a story that asks its audience to confront the uncomfortable truths of history, to recognize the humanity of those long dismissed, and to understand that acts of courage and reclamation can resonate far beyond the moment in which they occur. The Thanksgiving of that year was forever altered, leaving a mark not only on the Grayson family, but on the fabric of memory itself, reminding all who hear it that justice, when exercised with patience and precision, can leave an indelible mark upon history.